Officer Mark Stewart had always prided himself on being a man of the law. For over a decade, he had patrolled the quiet streets of Brentonville, a suburban town known for its calm and orderly nature. It was the kind of place where crime rarely made headlines, and residents felt safe walking their dogs late into the evening. Despite this tranquility, Mark's approach to policing was always cautious, some might say overzealous. He believed in rules and boundaries, and anyone who strayed from them was, in his eyes, a potential threat. To his colleagues, Mark was seen as the quintessential cop, disciplined, meticulous and firm, but beneath the surface, there lay an unspoken bias, a set of stereotypes that shaped his worldview. Though Mark would never admit it to himself, let alone others, his experiences had led him to judge certain people more harshly than others. In the back of his mind, he harbored a quiet prejudice, one that, despite his outward professionalism, influenced his decisions. In Brentonville, those biases rarely came into play until that one fateful night. Brentonville had changed over the years. Like many suburban towns across the country, the population was growing more diverse, and with that came growing tensions between law enforcement and the community. Incidents from larger cities often trickled into the consciousness of Brentonville's residents. Recent events involving police brutality had heightened awareness around issues of racial profiling, and protests had erupted in neighboring towns, sparking conversations Mark had never wanted to engage in. To him, these were isolated incidents, blown out of proportion by the media, and they had little to do with the way he patrolled his town. But that night, those same issues would come crashing into his quiet life. On a chilly evening, Mark drove his cruiser through one of Brentonville's upscale neighborhoods. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the streets, and the usually busy roads were empty. As he passed by a small grocery store parking lot, he noticed a man standing beside a sleek black car, staring at his phone. Something about the scene struck Mark as suspicious. The man was black, dressed in casual clothing that seemed out of place for the expensive car parked next to him. Mark slowed his cruiser, his instincts kicking in, and pulled into the lot. Another one of those situations, Mark thought, his mind automatically filling in the blanks. He had seen it before, someone up to no good, using their phone as a cover, waiting for the right moment to break into a car or worse. Without further thought, he decided to investigate. As he stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively rested on the holster of his gun, a reflex that had become second nature over the years. He approached the man, his gaze narrowing, already drawing conclusions from the man's appearance and the fact that he was standing alone in a mostly empty parking lot. "Evening," Mark said, his voice firm. "What are you doing here?" The man looked up from his phone, startled but calm. "Just waiting for my wife to come out of the store," he replied, his tone polite. He glanced toward the grocery store, where a few late-night shoppers were trickling out. Mark didn't buy it. Something about the man's demeanor didn't sit right with him. He ignored the explanation and continued his questioning. "Can I see your ID?" he asked, already assuming the man had a reason to be defensive. The man's brow furrowed slightly. "Is there a problem, officer? I'm just standing here waiting for someone." Mark's suspicion deepened. The more the man resisted, the guiltier he seemed. His tone hardened. "ID, now." Reluctantly, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, handing over his driver's license. Mark took it and glanced down at the name, Dr. James Harris. The name meant nothing to Mark, but the title caught his eye. "Doctor," he thought, skepticism flooding his mind. "You're a doctor?" Mark asked, a faint sneer creeping into his voice. His disbelief was palpable. "Yes, I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Brentonville General Hospital," James replied, his voice still calm, but with an edge of frustration. He could sense where this was going. Mark's grip on the ID tightened. He had heard stories like this before. He knew about people trying to avoid trouble by pretending to be someone important. Why would a doctor be standing around in a parking lot at this hour, he thought. His mind raced with assumptions, none of them good. The doubt that had been festering in Mark for years was now at the forefront of his mind, clouding his judgment. Instead of asking questions or seeking clarification, he followed his gut, the gut that had been conditioned by years of quiet prejudice. "You mind telling me why a doctor like you is standing around in this part of town, looking like you're up to something?" Mark asked, his tone accusatory. James, now visibly frustrated, tried to maintain his composure. "I already told you, officer. I'm waiting for my wife. I'm not up to something." But Mark wasn't satisfied. The words didn't seem to register with him, overshadowed by his own assumptions. To him, the doctor's explanation felt rehearsed, like an excuse to hide something more sinister. His hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup if things escalated. "Look, if you're not doing anything wrong, you won't mind if I take a closer look at what's going on here," Mark said, stepping forward, his body language radiating suspicion. At that moment, James realized what was happening. This wasn't about his actions. It wasn't about the car or the time of night. It was about the color of his skin. He had seen it before: the unwarranted suspicion, the questioning, the assumption of guilt before innocence. It was all too familiar. "Officer, with all due respect, I think you're overstepping your bounds here," James said, his patience wearing thin. "I've done nothing wrong, and you're treating me like a criminal." Mark's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he already deemed suspicious. His next words were more of a command than a request. "Step away from the car," Mark said, his hand now firmly on his gun holster. "I need to make sure everything's clear." James hesitated. "This is ridiculous. I'm not stepping away from my car for no reason. I've told you what I'm doing here." To Mark, the refusal was all the confirmation he needed. In his mind, only someone hiding something would resist an officer's request. His suspicion turned into certainty. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Mark ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. James was stunned. "Are you serious? I haven't done anything wrong." Now Mark barked, reaching for his handcuffs. In that moment, the scene shifted from a casual interaction to something much darker. Mark's prejudices had completely taken over, and all logic had flown out the window. He wasn't listening. He wasn't considering the context. He was following the narrative that had played in his head since the moment he saw James, a narrative that painted this successful black man as a threat simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. James, bewildered and angry, slowly complied, turning around as Mark roughly placed the handcuffs on him. "You're making a huge mistake," James said through gritted teeth. "You don't even know who I am." Mark wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. James Harris sat in the back of the squad car, his wrists bound tightly by the cold steel handcuffs. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the situation he was now in. How had this escalated so quickly? How had he, a respected surgeon, ended up here, humiliated and criminalized in front of strangers simply for standing next to his own car? The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the surrounding windows, casting long shadows across the parking lot as Officer Mark Stewart sat behind the wheel, driving them toward the station. The ride was silent, save for the low hum of the engine. James tried to control his breathing, trying to keep his anger in check, but each passing second fanned the flames of his frustration. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt. Hurt that after all his accomplishments, after everything he'd worked for, he could still be reduced to this another black man in handcuffs, guilty in the eyes of a cop, before even being heard. Mark, on the other hand, was outwardly calm, but inside, doubt began to gnaw at him. Something about the arrest felt off. He had expected resistance, aggression, maybe even a physical struggle, but none of that had happened. James Harris had complied, though with clear frustration, and the man's words still echoed in Mark's mind. "You're making a huge mistake. You don't even know who I am." The title of doctor still clung to Mark's consciousness, but his ego wouldn't allow him to admit that he might have overreacted. Pulling up to the station, Mark's partner, Officer Jake Harmon, was waiting by the entrance. Jake had been on the force longer than Mark and had become a close friend over the years. As Mark got out and opened the door to escort James inside, Jake's eyes flicked between them, sensing the tension. "What have we got here?" Jake asked, stepping forward. Mark gave a curt nod toward James. "Suspicious behavior. Loitering around a parking lot late at night. Claimed he's a doctor, but wouldn't cooperate," Mark said flatly, as if this were just another routine arrest. Jake raised an eyebrow and looked James over. Something didn't sit right with him, but he trusted Mark's judgment. "All right, let's process him." Inside the station, the cold fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as James was led to the booking area. A desk sergeant looked up from his paperwork, already weary from the evening's workload. "Name?" the sergeant asked, typing on his computer. "Dr. James Harris," James replied, his voice steady but simmering with anger. "Doctor," the sergeant repeated, momentarily glancing up at James, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What kind of doctor?" "Cardiothoracic surgeon," James said, his gaze unwavering as he stared at Mark, whose expression remained hard, though internally that small seed of doubt grew ever larger. The sergeant paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before continuing. "And what's the charge?" "Suspicion of criminal activity," Mark answered quickly, though even to him it sounded flimsy now. The sergeant furrowed his brow and looked over at James again. "Criminal activity," he repeated, unconvinced. "Like what?" "Loitering." "Acting suspiciously," Mark muttered, suddenly realizing how little weight those words carried now. His voice lacked the same authority it had when he'd made the arrest. The sergeant's skepticism was palpable, and Mark could feel the eyes of his fellow officers lingering. James, still standing in the processing area, had had enough. His patience, already stretched thin, snapped. "This is ridiculous. You've arrested me for standing next to my car in a parking lot. I've committed no crime. And you know it." His voice echoed through the small room, catching the attention of a few officers nearby. "Watch your tone," Mark warned, though his own confidence was faltering. "No, I won't," James shot back. "This is pure harassment, and you know it. You didn't arrest me because I was committing a crime. You arrested me because of what you thought I was, some criminal based on nothing but my skin color." The room grew tense. James' words hit hard, and Mark felt his stomach churn. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, a truth that Mark had been desperately trying to ignore. James was right. Mark's actions had been driven by assumption, not fact, and now, standing in front of his peers, with James challenging him directly, he couldn't escape the reality. But before he could respond, another voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" The room quieted as Police Chief Raymond Fuller entered. Fuller was a tall, imposing figure with years of experience that commanded respect. His presence alone seemed to demand answers. He walked over, scanning the scene, his eyes finally landing on James. "Chief, this man was acting suspiciously in a parking lot," Mark began, trying to regain control of the situation. "He wouldn't cooperate, so I brought him in." Fuller looked from Mark to James and back again. "Suspicious behavior." His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something else: disappointment. James, his composure back, looked the chief in the eyes. "I'm Dr. James Harris. I live in this town, and I was waiting for my wife to finish shopping when your officer decided I was a threat." His words were measured, but the anger was still there, barely contained. Chief Fuller's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward Mark with a silent question. "You sure about this?" Stuart Fuller asked quietly. For the first time, Mark hesitated. The confidence that had carried him through the arrest was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of doubt. He wanted to argue, to defend his actions, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong the whole situation was. He had acted without thinking, driven by fear and assumptions that had no basis in reality. "Maybe we should check his credentials," Mark said, his voice barely audible, but the words were enough to seal the growing tension in the room. Fuller nodded, and one of the officers quickly searched for James' records. It took only a few moments to confirm what James had said. All along he was indeed Dr. James Harris, a highly respected cardiothoracic surgeon at Brentonville General Hospital. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark could feel the stares of his colleagues burning into him. He had arrested an innocent man, a man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time and looking a certain way. Fuller's face hardened, and he turned to Mark. "Take those cuffs off, now." Mark moved quickly, fumbling with the key as he unlocked the handcuffs, his hands trembling. James rubbed his wrists, his eyes locked onto Mark with a look that was a mix of anger, disappointment, and something else, pity. Without another word, Chief Fuller walked back toward his office, leaving the room in an uncomfortable silence. Mark stood there, speechless, as James gathered his belongings. It was over, but Mark knew that the consequences of this night were only just beginning. The atmosphere at the Brentonville Police Department had shifted noticeably since James Harris walked out of the station that night. Mark Stewart, who had always been seen as an officer who followed the rules without question, now found himself at the center of a storm brewing inside the department. Word of the arrest had spread quickly among his colleagues, and the whispers had started. Many of them questioned the necessity of the arrest, while others, knowing Mark's track record, were less surprised. Mark tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, but the weight of his actions was becoming harder to ignore. Every glance from his fellow officers seemed more scrutinizing, and casual conversations became stilted, as though everyone was talking around him instead of with him. The arrest of Dr. James Harris had set off a chain reaction, and now Mark was beginning to feel its effects in ways he hadn't anticipated. Back at home, Mark found no solace either. His wife, Sarah, who had heard about the incident through a mutual friend, was livid when he walked through the door that evening. "Mark, what the hell were you thinking?" she demanded, arms crossed as she stood in the kitchen, staring at him with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "I just heard that you arrested a surgeon for no reason, a black surgeon. Do you realize what kind of trouble you're in?" Mark's defense mechanism kicked in, and he immediately put up his guard. "I was doing my job. Sarah, he was acting suspicious, and I had reason to believe." Sarah cut him off, her voice rising in exasperation. "Suspicious? Mark, he was waiting for his wife in a parking lot. He's a respected doctor in this community. You didn't even give him a chance to explain before slapping cuffs on him. How do you not see the problem here?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he had no immediate response. He knew deep down that Sarah was right, but admitting that would mean acknowledging the darker side of his policing the side he had always been reluctant to confront. That night, sleep didn't come easily for Mark. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he replayed the events of the arrest in his mind. He remembered the anger and hurt in James' eyes, the feeling of control slipping away from him when the truth came to light at the station. The weight of what he had done gnawed at him, though he wasn't ready to fully accept it yet. Instead, he rationalized his actions, telling himself that it was standard procedure, that he had followed protocol. But deep down, that small seed of doubt was growing. At the police station, the fallout from the arrest was becoming more visible. An internal investigation had been opened, as complaints of racial bias in policing were already a sensitive topic in Brentonville. The community was on edge, and tensions between the police and minority groups had been steadily rising over the years. Chief Raymond Fuller wasn't one to ignore such issues, especially with a case as high-profile as this one. "Stewart, in my office," Fuller's voice called from down the hall one morning, interrupting Mark as he reviewed case files at his desk. Mark had been dreading this moment. He rose from his chair, his face stoic as he walked through the narrow corridor toward the chief's office. As he entered, he saw Fuller seated behind his desk, his expression hard, yet unreadable. "Sit down," Fuller ordered, motioning to the chair across from him. Mark obeyed, his back stiff and his hands resting on his knees. He felt like a schoolboy about to be reprimanded by the principal. Fuller leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk as he looked directly at Mark. "We need to talk about the Harris situation," he began, his voice low but firm. "I'm sure you're aware that this incident has put a spotlight on our department, or bad spotlight." Mark nodded, but he remained silent. He knew Fuller wasn't the type to sugarcoat things. Fuller continued, "I've known you for a long time. I've seen your work. You're a good cop, but this is not how we operate. You arrested a man who posed no threat, a surgeon, for Christ's sake. And it wasn't just the arrest, it's the way you handled it. You treated him like a criminal without a second thought." "I was following protocol," Mark interjected, though his voice lacked conviction. He was acting suspiciously, and Fuller's hand shot up, silencing him. "Don't give me that protocol bullshit, Mark. We both know this wasn't about protocol. This was about you making assumptions that had nothing to do with the facts of the situation." The words hit hard, and for the first time, Mark couldn't find a rebuttal. Fuller's bluntness left no room for excuses, and it forced Mark to confront the uncomfortable truth he'd been avoiding. "I'm placing you on administrative leave until the investigation is complete," Fuller said, leaning back in his chair. "This is serious, Mark. We're talking potential lawsuits, media coverage, and the reputation of this department. I need you to take a hard look at what happened and ask yourself if you really acted in the best interest of the law, or if something else was driving your decisions that night." Mark sat in stunned silence. Administrative leave. The words stung more than he expected. Being taken off duty felt like a blow to his identity, his sense of purpose. Policing was what he knew, what he had built his life around. Without it, what was left? Fuller didn't wait for a response. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave the station. We'll be in touch." Mark stood, his movements stiff, as he handed over his badge and holstered weapon. As he left Fuller's office, the weight of his actions pressed down on him like never before. His colleagues avoided eye contact as he walked through the station, the silence of their judgment hanging in the air. Outside the station, Mark sat in his car for what felt like an eternity. He gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the grey clouds that hovered over Brentonville. Everything felt surreal, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. For the first time in his career, Mark was forced to confront something he had spent years suppressing: the biases that had shaped the way he viewed the world, the ones he had always dismissed as normal. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Jake Harmon, his partner. "Hey man," I heard. "You good? Let's grab a drink tonight." Mark hesitated. He wasn't sure if he was in the mood to talk to anyone, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding this forever. With a heavy sigh, he typed out a quick reply. "Sure, see you at the usual spot." That evening, Mark found himself sitting at the corner of a dimly lit bar, a glass of whiskey in front of him. Jake arrived shortly after, sliding into the seat across from him. "You look like hell," Jake remarked, flagging down the bartender for a drink. Mark took a slow sip of his whiskey, the burn doing little to numb the knot in his stomach. "Yeah, well, it's been one hell of a week." Jake nodded sympathetically. "I get it, man. This whole thing with the Harris guy, it's blown up fast." "Yeah," Mark muttered, swirling the ice in his glass. "Fuller put me on leave." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Damn, that's serious, huh?" Mark nodded, his expression dark. "Yeah, I messed up, Jake, big time, and now everyone's looking at me like I'm the villain." Jake leaned back in his seat, taking a swig of his beer. "Look, you're not a bad guy, Mark. You were doing your job, right? People screw up. This'll blow over." But Mark wasn't so sure. Deep down, he knew this was different. This wasn't just a minor mistake or a routine arrest gone wrong. This was something deeper, something that had been festering in him for years, and now it had exploded in the worst possible way. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice low. "This one feels different." For the first time, Mark Stewart The officer who had always prided himself on being right was beginning to question everything. The days following Mark's suspension blurred together in a haze of self-reflection and isolation. At first, he had convinced himself that the department was overreacting, that he had only been doing his job, but the more he replayed the incident in his mind, the more undeniable the truth became. He hadn't just arrested James Harris because of the situation, he had arrested him because of the color of his skin, and he knew it. Sitting at home, Mark tried to ignore the growing sense of guilt that gnawed at him. Sarah had barely spoken to him since that night in the kitchen, leaving an icy distance between them that made the silence of their house unbearable. Mark spent most of his days in front of the television, flipping through channels without paying attention to any of them. His mind was far away, lost in a sea of questions he had never wanted to ask himself. One evening, Mark's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unfamiliar number, but something compelled him to answer. Mark Stewart, the voice on the other end, asked. "Yeah, who's this?" Mark replied, his tone gruff. "This is Charles Anderson. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. James Harris." Mark froze. James Harris. Of course, he should have expected this. "There's no need to panic," Anderson continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not calling to discuss legal action yet. Dr. Harris wants to meet with you." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Meet with me? What for?" "To talk," Anderson said. "That's all. No lawyers, no cameras, no police. Just a conversation." Mark was silent for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Why would Harris want to talk to him? After everything that had happened, what was left to say? But something in Anderson's voice hinted at sincerity, and Mark found himself reluctantly agreeing. "All right," Mark said. "When and where?" The following afternoon, Mark found himself sitting in a small coffee shop in the heart of Brentonville. The warm smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but Mark barely noticed. His stomach was in knots as he waited, staring at the door every few seconds. What would he say to James Harris? What could he possibly say? A few minutes later, the door opened, and in walked Dr. James Harris. He was dressed casually in a button-down shirt and jeans, but there was an air of professionalism about him that made Mark feel even more out of place. Harris spotted him immediately and walked over to the table without hesitation. "Officer Stewart," Harris said, extending his hand. Mark hesitated, then shook it. "Dr. Harris." They sat down across from each other, the tension between them palpable. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Mark stared into his coffee cup, unsure of how to begin. "I want to start by saying this isn't about revenge," Harris said, breaking the silence. "I didn't ask you here to make you feel bad or to rub anything in your face." Mark looked up, surprised by the calmness in Harris's voice. There was no anger, no bitterness. Instead, Harris seemed genuinely interested in having a real conversation. "I just want to understand," Harris continued. "Why did you do it? Why did you arrest me that night?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. How could he explain something he hadn't even fully processed himself? He had spent years justifying his actions, telling himself that he was simply being cautious, that he was keeping the community safe. But now, sitting face to face with the man he had wronged, those excuses felt hollow. I don't know," Mark finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought you were up to something. You looked suspicious. And I reacted." "Reacted," Harris repeated, his tone thoughtful. "Reacted to what? Exactly." "My presence, my skin color." Mark flinched at the directness of the question, but he knew it was one he couldn't avoid. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Maybe it was. I don't know. I've never thought about it before." Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Mark for a moment. "Do you know what it's like to be constantly judged by how you look? To have people assume the worst of you before they even know your name? That's something I've lived with my entire life." Mark's throat tightened. He had never thought about it that way, never considered the toll that constant judgment could take on someone. He had always seen himself as someone who judged based on actions, not appearances, but now he was beginning to realize how deeply his biases ran. "I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty," Harris said. "I just want you to understand what it's like. I'm a surgeon, Mark. I save lives for a living, but none of that mattered to you that night. All you saw was a black man standing next to a nice car, and you assumed I was a criminal." Mark's chest felt heavy, and for the first time in his life he didn't have a defense. He had nothing to say to justify his actions, no way to explain away the truth that was staring him in the face. "I messed up," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "I messed up bad." Harris didn't respond right away. He just sat there, watching Mark as he struggled with the weight of his own words. "I appreciate you saying that," Harris finally said, his voice softening. "But what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Mark had spent years hiding behind his badge, using his authority as a shield to protect himself from uncomfortable truths. But now there was no more hiding. He had to confront who he really was, and more importantly, who he wanted to be moving forward. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "I really don't know." Harris nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "It's a start," he said. "But it's not enough." They sat in silence for a few more minutes before Harris stood up. "Look, I don't expect you to change overnight. This isn't just about you. It's about a system that's been in place for a long time. But if you're willing to take a hard look at yourself and at the way you've been operating, then maybe, just maybe, things can get better." Mark watched as Harris turned to leave, his words lingering in the air long after he had gone. He felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling, like everything he had built his life around was suddenly being called into question. For the first time in his career, Mark felt powerless, not because of an external threat, but because of the internal reckoning that was beginning to unfold. As the weeks passed, Mark's suspension dragged on, and the internal investigation into the arrest of Dr. Harris intensified. The media had picked up on the story, though it hadn't yet blown up into a national headline. But within the Brentonville community, the tension was palpable. Protests had been organized, with members of the black community calling for accountability and change within the police department. Mark spent most of his days in his quiet home, watching the news and avoiding his neighbors. He knew he had become a pariah in the town, and even Sarah's patience with him had run out. She had moved in with her sister temporarily, leaving Mark to stew in his own guilt. One afternoon, as Mark sat on his porch, staring out at the empty street, his phone rang. It was a familiar number this time. Stuart Chief Fuller's voice came through the line. "I need you to come into the station tomorrow. We're going to have a formal review of the Harris case. You're expected to give your testimony." Mark's stomach churned. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it was inevitable. "I'll be there," he said, his voice tight. The next day, Mark walked into the station for the first time since his suspension. The familiar smells of coffee and stale air greeted him, but the station felt different. Colleagues avoided eye contact, conversations stopped when he entered a room, and the weight of judgment pressed down on him. In the conference room, Chief Fuller sat at the head of the table, flanked by the department's legal team and a few officers who had been involved in the internal investigation. Mark took his seat at the far end, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to face the consequences of his actions. Officer Stuart Fuller began, his tone measured. "You're here today to answer for your conduct during the arrest of Dr. James Harris. We've reviewed the evidence, spoken to witnesses, and taken into account your service record. Now, it's time for you to explain your side of the story." Mark swallowed hard, his mouth dry. This was it. No more excuses. No more justifications, just the truth. I made a mistake," Mark said, his voice low but steady. "I acted out of bias, and I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I didn't see Dr. Harris for who he really was. I saw him through the lens of my own prejudices, and I made a terrible decision because of it. The room was silent, the weight of Mark's confession hanging in the air. Mark Stewart had always thought of himself as indestructible, but the past few weeks had shattered that illusion. His suspension, the internal investigation, and the confrontational meeting with Dr. Harris had unraveled everything he thought he knew about himself, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen next.
It was late one afternoon, just as Mark was trying to settle into the uncomfortable rhythm of life on suspension. His house, usually a refuge, now felt suffocating. Sarah hadn't returned home, and Mark had grown used to the silence that filled every room. He spent his days pacing, checking his phone for any updates on the investigation, and waiting for anything to change.
But on that day, it wasn't the phone that delivered the news, it was his chest. Without warning, a sharp, excruciating pain shot through his ribcage, taking his breath away. Mark staggered, clutching his chest as the room spun around him. His vision blurred, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. He didn't have time to think, to rationalize what was happening. All he knew was that he needed help. His trembling hand reached for his phone, dialing 911 as the pain radiated through his body, each wave more intense than the last. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" I think I'm having a heart attack," Mark wheezed, barely able to get the words out.
The operator's voice was calm, but Mark could hear the urgency in her tone. "Help is on the way. Stay on the line."
Minutes felt like hours as he lay on the cold floor, his mind racing between thoughts of survival and the horrifying realization that he might not make it. Was this how it was going to end? Alone, broken, brought to his knees by a heart that could no longer handle the weight of his guilt. The paramedics arrived quickly, loading Mark onto a stretcher as the world around him faded in and out of focus. The last thing he remembered was the blaring sound of the ambulance siren as they rushed him to Brentonville General Hospital, the very hospital where Dr. James Harris worked. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Mark's condition had worsened. The pain was unbearable, and his breathing had become shallow. He could hear the frantic voices of the emergency room staff as they wheeled him into the operating room, their faces blurred and indistinct. And then, through the haze, he heard a familiar voice. "What's his condition?" Dr. James Harris asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Mark's heart skipped a beat, not from the attack, but from the realization that the man standing over him, the man who now held his life in his hands, was none other than Dr. Harris, the same man he had unjustly arrested not long ago. Severe chest pain, irregular heart rate. "We think it's a myocardial infarction," one of the nurses replied, handing Dr. Harris a chart. James glanced at the chart, his expression unreadable. "We need to stabilize him immediately. Get the team ready for surgery. Time is critical." Mark tried to speak, tried to say anything, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His mind was a swirl of confusion and terror. He wanted to tell Dr. Harris that he was sorry, that he had made a mistake, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was lie there, helpless, as the man he had wronged prepared to save his life. Dr. Harris's voice was calm and professional as he directed the surgical team. "We need to move quickly. Prep him for surgery, and let's get him under anesthesia." As the anesthesiologist moved in, Mark felt his body start to relax as the sedative took hold. His last conscious thought was the irony of the situation. He, a man who had spent his career making snap judgments, was now at the mercy of someone he had judged so wrongly. Hours later, Mark awoke in a hospital bed, the dull beeping of machines surrounding him. The room was dimly lit, and the sterile smell of the hospital filled his senses. He blinked, his mind still groggy from the anesthesia, and slowly became aware of his surroundings. His chest ached, but the searing pain had subsided. He was alive. For a moment he felt a wave of relief until he remembered how he had gotten here. The memory of Dr. Harris's voice echoed in his mind, and a new kind of pain began to set in, shame. As if on cue, the door to his room opened, and Dr. Harris stepped inside, his expression neutral. He approached the bed, glancing at the monitors before meeting Mark's eyes. "You're lucky," Dr. Harris said, his voice calm. "We managed to get you into surgery just in time. You had a major blockage in one of your coronary arteries." Mark swallowed, his throat dry. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest made him wince. I don't know what to say," he finally managed to croak. "You don't have to say anything right now," Dr. Harris replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Just focus on recovering." But Mark couldn't leave it at that. He couldn't let this moment pass without acknowledging the enormity of what had happened. He had wronged this man, humiliated him, stripped him of his dignity, and now that same man had saved his life. "I'm sorry," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion. I made a terrible mistake. I don't know why I did what I did, but I'm sorry." Dr. Harris was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a long breath and nodded. "I appreciate the apology, Officer Stewart, but this isn't about me. It's about you. You have to live with the choices you've made." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He knew Dr. Harris was right. This wasn't just about one bad decision, it was about the years of unchecked biases, the split-second judgments he had made without questioning where they came from. "I know," Mark said quietly. "I know I do."
Dr. Harris glanced at the clock on the wall. "You should rest. I'll check in on you later."
With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time since the arrest, Mark felt the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore, this was about redemption, and for the first time in his life, Mark didn't know if he deserved it. The next few days passed slowly as Mark recovered from the surgery. Nurses came and went, checking his vitals and making sure he was healing properly. But the real healing that needed to happen wasn't in his body, it was in his soul. Mark had spent years as a police officer, priding himself on being a man of the law, a protector of the community. But now, that image had been shattered. He had to confront the reality that he wasn't the man he thought he was. On the third day, Dr. Harris visited again. This time, the conversation was different. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Harris asked as he checked Mark's chart. "Better," Mark replied, though his voice was still weak. "Physically, at least." Dr. Harris nodded. "You had a close call, Mark. You need to take care of yourself moving forward. No more ignoring the warning signs." Mark nodded, but his mind wasn't on his physical health. "I can't stop thinking about that night," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I've been going over it again and again in my head, and I don't know why I did it." Dr. Harris looked at him thoughtfully. "People like you and me, we deal with life and death situations all the time. We're trained to act quickly, to make decisions in the moment. But sometimes those instincts are shaped by things we don't even realize: biases, prejudices, fear." Mark's chest tightened, not from the surgery, but from the truth in Dr. Harris's words. "I don't want to be that kind of person," Mark said quietly. "I don't want to be the guy who judges someone before I even know them." Dr. Harris gave a small nod. "Then don't be. It's never too late to change, Mark, but change doesn't happen overnight. It's something you have to work at every day." Mark swallowed hard. He knew Dr. Harris was right. This was just the beginning of a long, painful journey, a journey toward understanding, toward redemption. And it was a journey he would have to take alone. As Dr. Harris left the room, Mark closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His body may have been healing, but his soul was still fractured. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Mark Stewart was no longer the man he used to be. He couldn't be. The man who had made those snap judgments, who had let his biases dictate his actions, that man was gone. In his place stood someone different, someone who had been humbled, someone who had been saved by the very person he had wronged. And for the first time in his life, Mark Stewart didn't know what came next. Mark Stewart had always believed that the hardest part of being a police officer was facing danger head-on. He had been trained to handle life-threatening situations, to maintain control under pressure. But now, lying in a hospital bed, he realized that real courage wasn't about facing external threats, it was about confronting the person he had become, and that was proving to be far more difficult. Days after his surgery, Mark was discharged from Brentonville General Hospital, but the recovery process was far from over. The physical pain would subside in time, but the emotional and psychological wounds were deeper than any incision. Dr. Harris had saved his life, but Mark knew he would have to live with the consequences of his actions for much longer. The night he returned home, the silence was deafening. The house felt emptier than ever, a hollow shell of the life he had once known. Sarah still hadn't come back, and Mark couldn't blame her. She needed time, just like he did. Time to process what had happened. Time to figure out what came next. As he sat in the dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the walls, Mark's phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Chief Raymond Fuller. "We need to talk. Come to the station tomorrow morning." Mark's stomach churned. He had been dreading this moment ever since his heart attack. He knew the investigation into the Harris arrest had been ongoing, and he was certain that it hadn't gone well, but now it seemed like the moment of reckoning had arrived. The next morning, Mark walked into the Brentonville Police Department for what felt like the last time. The usual hum of activity surrounded him, but it felt distant, like a world he no longer belonged to. Colleagues who used to greet him with friendly nods now averted their eyes, their faces filled with judgment and disappointment. Mark felt the weight of their stares as he made his way to Chief Fuller's office. Fuller was waiting for him, sitting behind his desk with a stack of papers in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Sit down," Mark Fuller said, his voice devoid of the usual warmth. Mark did as he was told, the chair creaking under his weight as he settled in. "I'm going to be straight with you," Fuller began, leaning forward. "The investigation into your conduct during the arrest of Dr. James Harris is over, and the findings aren't good." Mark felt his heart sink. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still hit him like a punch to the gut. "We've reviewed the body cam footage, the testimonies from witnesses, and Dr. Harris's statement," Fuller continued. "It's clear that your actions that night were not only unjustified but driven by racial bias. You arrested an innocent man without cause, and the department cannot and will not tolerate that." Mark's throat tightened. He had never imagined that his career would end like this, but now it seemed inevitable. "I'm sorry," Mark Fuller said, his voice softening slightly, "but you're being terminated from the force, effective immediately." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mark felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. His badge, his identity was being taken away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it.
"You'll receive a formal letter outlining the reasons for your termination, along with information about your pension," Fuller added. "I'll need you to turn in your badge and gun before you leave."
Mark sat in stunned silence for a moment, his mind reeling. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it was still hard to process. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out his badge and holstered gun, placing them on the desk in front of Fuller. The chief's expression softened, and for a brief moment, he looked like the mentor Mark had known for so many years. "I'm sorry it had to end this way," Mark Fuller said quietly. "You've been a good officer for most of your career, but this was a line we couldn't cross." Mark nodded numbly, unable to find the words to respond. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead as he walked out of the office for the last time. The world outside the station felt different, colder, more distant. He was no longer Officer Stewart. He was just Mark. Weeks passed, and the reality of his new life began to set in. Without the structure of the police force, Mark felt adrift, unsure of who he was or where he belonged. Sarah had returned home, but their relationship was strained. They barely spoke, the tension between them thick and unresolved. Mark knew she was disappointed in him, not just for the arrest, but for the person he had become. One evening, as they sat in the living room in awkward silence, Sarah finally broke the tension. "Mark," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "we need to talk about what's been happening."
Mark looked up from his drink, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable.
"I know I've been distant," Sarah continued, "but it's been hard to process everything. The arrest, the heart attack. It's like you're a completely different person." Mark sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know who I am anymore," he admitted. "Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it." Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes filled with sadness. "You need to face what happened, Mark. You can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. You need to take responsibility for your actions." Mark swallowed hard, knowing she was right, but the thought of confronting what he had done, the damage he had caused, was terrifying. "I've been thinking about seeing a therapist," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need help figuring things out." Sarah nodded, her expression softening. "That's a good start, Mark, but it's not just about therapy. It's about making amends for what you did to Dr. Harris and for what you've been doing to yourself." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent so long running from the truth, but now there was no more hiding. He needed to face the man he had become and figure out if there was any hope of redemption. A week later, Mark found himself standing outside Dr. James Harris's office at Brentonville General Hospital. He had rehearsed what he was going to say 100 times, but now, standing there, his mind was blank, his palms were sweaty, and his heart raced with anxiety, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly. After a moment, the door opened and Dr. Harris stood there, looking surprised to see him. "Mark," Dr. Harris said, his voice neutral, "what are you doing here?" Mark took a deep breath, his chest tight with emotion. "Hi, I came to apologize," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I know I already said it before, but I need you to hear it again. I'm sorry. For everything." Dr. Harris studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside to let Mark into the office. Mark entered, feeling out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital. He sat down across from Dr. Harris, who took a seat behind his desk. "I know that what I did was wrong," Mark began, his voice shaky. "I arrested you because I let my biases get the better of me. I didn't see you for who you really are, I only saw the color of your skin, and I'm ashamed of that." Dr. Harris listened quietly, his face calm but serious. "I've been fired from the force," Mark continued, "and honestly, I don't know what's next for me, but I know I need to make things right. I need to take responsibility for what I did, and I need to learn how to be better." Dr. Harris was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Mark carefully. Finally, he spoke. "Mark, I appreciate your apology, and I believe you're sincere," he said, "but words aren't enough. If you want to make things right, you have to be willing to put in the work. This isn't just about one incident, this is about changing the way you think, the way you see the world." Mark nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I've seen a lot of people in my life who've made mistakes, big mistakes, but the ones who make it through are the ones who are willing to confront their demons and learn from them. If you're serious about changing, then I believe you can." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this was only the beginning of a long journey.
"I want to make things right," Mark said again, his voice stronger this time. "I don't want to be the person I was. I want to be better." Dr. Harris nodded, standing up and extending his hand.
"Then let's start with this," he said, offering a handshake. Mark stood, taking Dr. Harris's hand in his own. As they shook, Mark felt a sense of closure, but also a sense of responsibility. He had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. Mark Stewart walked out of Dr. Harris's office feeling lighter, but the weight of his past actions still lingered in the back of his mind. The handshake he had shared with Dr. Harris was a beginning, but not an end. Mark knew that the real work of rebuilding his life and his character was only just starting. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with moments of self-doubt and painful realizations, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had taken a step in the right direction. The next few weeks were a blur of therapy sessions, awkward dinners with Sarah, and countless hours of reflection. Therapy was harder than he had expected. Confronting years of ingrained bias and defensive thinking was like peeling back layers of himself he hadn't even realized were there. Each session with his therapist, Dr. Carter, unearthed memories and patterns of behavior that Mark had ignored or justified for most of his life. But as painful as it was, Mark knew it was necessary. "You've been operating on autopilot for a long time," Dr. Carter had told him during one session. "It's like a reflex. You see someone make a judgment and react without questioning it. We need to break that cycle." Mark had nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. He had spent his entire career believing that he was a fair and just officer, that his decisions were based on facts and instincts. But now he was beginning to see that those instincts had been shaped by something deeper, something darker that he had never truly confronted. At home, things between Mark and Sarah were slowly improving. Their conversations were still strained at times, but there were moments of connection that gave Mark hope. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Sarah finally broke the silence that had hung between them for weeks. "I can see that you're trying," she said softly, her hand resting on his. "I know this isn't easy for you, but I appreciate that you're taking responsibility. That's all I've ever wanted." Mark looked at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "I'm sorry, Sarah, I should have listened to you sooner. I should have been better." Sarah smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. "We'll get through this. Together." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure if their marriage would ever be the same as it once was, but at least they were moving forward together. Meanwhile, the fallout from Mark's termination was still reverberating through the community. The story of Dr. Harris's wrongful arrest had made its way into local news, sparking debates about racial bias in policing and the need for reform. Protesters had gathered outside the Brentonville Police Department, calling for more transparency and accountability. Mark watched the news coverage from his living room, feeling a strange mix of guilt and helplessness. This was the system he had been a part of for so many years, and now it was crumbling around him. One day, Mark received a phone call from a former colleague, Jake Harmon. Jake had been one of the few officers who had reached out to Mark after his suspension, but their conversations had been brief and uncomfortable. "Mark, we need to talk," Jake said, his voice tense. "There's something happening at the department. They're doing a full review of all of our arrest records. And, well, some stuff's coming out. People are getting nervous." Mark wasn't surprised. He had known that Dr. Harris's case would likely open a can of worms, but hearing it from Jake made it real. The department was under scrutiny, and it wasn't just him. Other officers he had worked with for years were now being questioned for their conduct. "What do you want me to do?" Mark asked, his voice weary. "I don't know," Jake admitted. I thought you should know. Things are changing, man. It's not just about you anymore." Mark hung up the phone, feeling a deep sense of unease. He had always believed in the brotherhood of the police force, but now he wasn't sure where he stood. The world was changing around him, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know if he had a place in it. A few weeks later, Mark received an invitation to attend a community forum on policing and racial bias. It was being organized by a local advocacy group in response to the protests, and several members of the police department, including Chief Fuller, were scheduled to speak. At first, Mark wasn't sure if he should go. He wasn't an officer anymore. What could he possibly contribute? But something inside him told him that he needed to be there, even if it was just to listen. The forum was held in the auditorium of Brentonville High School. When Mark arrived, the room was already filled with community members, activists, police officers, and local leaders. The atmosphere was tense but charged with a sense of urgency. People were ready for change, and they weren't going to wait for it any longer. Mark took a seat near the back, hoping to blend in. He listened as speaker after speaker took the stage, sharing their experiences with police harassment, racial profiling, and the fear they felt every time they left their homes. It was hard to hear, but Mark knew it was necessary. These were the voices he had ignored for so long, the people he had failed to protect. Finally, it was Dr. Harris's turn to speak. Mark hadn't known he would be there, but as soon as he saw him take the stage, his heart began to race. Dr. Harris was calm and composed, but there was a fire in his words as he spoke about his own experience with police bias. "I've lived in Brentonville for over 10 years, Dr. Harris began, his voice steady. "I've built a life here, served this community, and yet, in the eyes of some, I'm still seen as a suspect before I'm seen as a person. That's the reality for so many of us people of color who are judged not by what we've done, but by how we look." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. Mark felt a lump in his throat as Dr. Harris continued. "But this isn't just about one officer or one department. This is about a system that has been built on bias, a system that needs to be torn down and rebuilt with accountability and justice at its core. We can't keep pretending that this is just the way things are. We have to change, and that change starts with us." When Dr. Harris finished, the room erupted in applause. Mark sat there, motionless, feeling both inspired and ashamed. Dr. Harris's words had cut deep, but they had also given him hope. Maybe there was a way forward after all. After the forum, Mark approached Dr. Harris. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't leave without acknowledging what had just happened. "Dr. Harris," Mark said, his voice quiet but earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said up there and for everything else." Dr. Harris looked at him, his expression thoughtful. "You've got a long road ahead of you, Mark, but I believe you're capable of walking it." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of resolve he hadn't felt in months. "I want to help," he said. "I don't know how, but I want to be part of the solution." Dr. Harris studied him for a moment, then nodded. "There's a lot of work to be done. If you're serious, we could use someone with your experience on the inside." Mark felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose again.
In the months that followed, Mark became involved with the local advocacy group, working alongside community leaders and activists to push for police reform in Brentonville. He attended meetings, spoke at forums, and shared his story with others, hoping that by admitting his mistakes, he could help prevent others from making the same ones.
It wasn't easy. There were times when the guilt felt overwhelming, and he questioned whether he deserved to be part of this movement at all. But each time he doubted himself, he remembered Dr. Harris's words, "You have to live with the choices you've made," and Mark was determined to live with them, not by running away, but by facing them head-on. Slowly, things began to change. The police department implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. A civilian oversight board was established to hold officers accountable for their actions, and while the road to justice was still long, the people of Brentonville were finally moving in the right direction. As for Mark, he continued his journey of self-discovery and redemption. He knew he would never fully erase the mistakes of his past, but he also knew that he didn't have to be defined by them. He could choose to be better. He could choose to change. And so, one day at a time, that's exactly what he did.